Well, let me conclude by saying that when you look at Lincoln in total, we have many, many special bonds of endearment for this great American. He was a great example, and for some of us, I think, almost a role model. He was a great commoner, and that means he was one of us. He exemplified virtues that we all admire, that being courage, honesty, and humility. His simplicity, I believe, is also a bond, because you never have trouble understanding what he wrote or what he said. Certainly the tragedy of his death stamps an imprint on our emotions. Lincoln was also an original. Yet most of all, I believe that Lincoln is a source of unending inspiration. When you and I are in situations in which we feel challenged and maybe stretched, I believe it is wonderful to think about and read what Lincoln said. I know very well that others might in this matter do better than I can, but I am here. I must do the best I can. I think it is encouraging and inspiring if we're writing a speech or preparing for a class and maybe we haven't had enough time and maybe it's a challenging subject that's more difficult than maybe some of our favorites, to remember that Lincoln was still working on the Gettysburg Address the morning in which he presented it. I'm sure that people who are born into great families that have accomplished a lot must feel great pride. But how about the rest of us who come from humble stock, from pretty humble beginnings? And we look at a man who many people came from poor white trash. And if somebody as great as Lincoln can rise up from poor white trash, then there's hope for Bill Anderson and other people who came from low beginnings. And think about the self-respect that Lincoln had, which is so important in building our confidence. He once said, "I desire to so conduct the affairs of this administration that if the end, when I come to lay down the reins of power, I have lost every other friend on earth, I shall at least have one friend left, and that friend shall be inside of me." Finally, I believe that Lincoln's inspiration is a legacy that will never die, and I appreciate your attention.
We do have about 5 minutes time for questions, if any of you have any.
Please.
What was Lincoln's position while he was studying to be a lawyer and working on thinking about emancipation, about the British experience in the West Indies, where they had paid or compensated emancipation of the slaves in Jamaica and other holdings that the British had as a model for what could have perhaps happened in the United States? Do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't think Lincoln really thought about that. I don't think he really understood that. The whole idea of his initial approach on slavery really originated with the position of his role model, Henry Clay. Yes?
What was his position on the 3/5 compromise? I don't think I've ever read anything about how he felt about that particular part of the Constitution.
I don't think you've ever read about it, and I don't think I have or anyone else. You know, one of my goals is to read all of Lincoln's collected works. I'm sure you know there are 8 volumes. Pardon?
Well, actually, I think Lincoln did
Okay.
have a position
Okay.
on this.
Okay. Thank you.
Lincoln,
I'm going to learn.
Lincoln pointed out in one of his addresses or letters that the word slavery was never used in the Constitution because the founders implicitly hoped that that peculiar institution would die out. That's the only thing that I'm aware of, though, surrounding the 3/5 compromise.
Thank you.
I was just reading one of the articles of the Constitution they were talking about that, the 3/5. You know, your representation. I have a question.
Yes.
You brought the line about Charleston, South Carolina, which is interesting. I was reading last night actually about Calhoun and his opposition to Jackson, and Jackson almost going into the South to shove it down the throat.
Right.
But and that continued, right? That was sort of right up to the Civil War. That was part of the situation, was it not?
Oh yeah. John C. Calhoun was the greatest advocate of all of states' rights, and they were very, very fearful if more, and the South literally controlled the Senate, okay? And if there were more free states, then the North would also take over control of the Senate. And he was very, very concerned. Slavery was, and the whole attitude of the South was going to be severely threatened.
So Jackson, though he himself was an apologist for slavery, the idea of keeping Union together superseded that, and he forced the issue with Calhoun. And Calhoun backed down because of that implied force, or
Sure.
overt force, I would say.
Jackson was not an advocate of emancipation of
Correct.
slaves, not at all. But he was very, very strong on the Union. And Jackson had a reputation and a persona that when he said he was going to do something, you knew he was going to do it. You know, if it meant war, we were going to have war. You know, and Calhoun and those people in South Carolina knew that. And so they obviously decided they didn't want to take him on.
Thank you.
If you could rank all the books that you've read about Lincoln, which would be your top 3?
Well, most of us start, you know, with, because we can't spend our lives just reading Lincoln, or, you know, you got a lot of subjects to cover and a lot of things to read about, but you'd start with what's the best single volume biography. And right now, historians have concluded it's David Donald's book. And I mentioned that James McPherson, who's written the best single volume on the Civil War, The Battle Cry of Freedom, and says that Ron White's book is going to supersede it because he had access to new material. But, you know, I like James McPherson a whole lot, but I'm a little bit wondering because Ron White was one of his students. But so that would be one. Douglas.
You like Team of Rivals. So
Oh yeah, thank you. Team of Rivals would be in that list, and then I guess I'm gonna. It's such a hard question to have 3. I think it's Douglas Wilson's book, Lincoln's Sword. Doug Wilson, I'll talk about him in the next presentation I made, but he's won the Lincoln Prize 2 times in a row. That's a $50,000 award from Gettysburg College. And he won it first for the book Honor's Voice, and then he won it again for Lincoln's Sword. And either one of them, because I think about, again, writing something today that changes the interpretation profoundly. And his first book on Honor's Voice deals with the Anne Rutledge issue. And James Garfield Randall, who wrote the best 4-volume biography of Lincoln, who was the dean of scholars of Lincoln from the University of Illinois, said that Herndon's oral history that he did of people who knew Lincoln about Anne Rutledge is just not accurate. And John Simon, who was my major professor at SIU and the greatest Grant expert, started the revisionist interpretation of that. Doug Wilson picked it up. And Doug Wilson has so convincingly contradicted James Garfield's conclusion to say, you know, we all know that there was an Anne Rutledge, but Lincoln and Anne Rutledge were deeply in love and perhaps would have been married, and that when she died suddenly, Lincoln was terribly distraught. And so everybody today says Randall is wrong, Doug Wilson is right with Honor's Voice. And then this book, Lincoln's Sword, what he's really saying is the sword is more powerful, the pen is more powerful than the sword, and it's just a brilliant book. It's going to be a classic in history.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
As a token of our appreciation, I'd like to present Dr. Bill Anderson with a Hauenstein Center tote bag. And there's something.
There's a lunch in there.
Yeah, something in there. That's right.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for a magisterial opening to our Lincoln Lecture Series. Within this conference, I invite you to come back at 10:15, this room, for Brian Flanagan's address. It's called Lincoln and the Power of Myth. It'll be in this room, correct?
Yes, but also Steve Couts will be speaking one room over.
And Steve Couts will be speaking on Abraham Lincoln, Democratic Statesman, down here at Grandview. Thank you very much.